August 16, 1943. The Baltic Coast, German Reich. The low, insistent wail of the air raid siren was a sound everyone at the Piedmont Army Research Center had grown to ignore. They called them Tommy's Mosquitoes, the high-speed British reconnaissance planes that buzzed the coast with impunity. But tonight, the sound was different. It wasn't the distant whine of a lone scout. It was a rising, complex cacophony, the massed rumble of an aerial armada. In the bunker beneath the sprawling secret facility, Dr. Wernher von Braun straightened his tie, a fastidious gesture even as the ground beneath his polished boots began to tremor. He was only 31, a brilliant physicist with a boyish charm that belied the monumental engine of destruction he'd helped create, the V2 rocket. Around him, technicians in field gray uniforms exchanged glances. They were building the future, a weapon that could strike London from over 200 miles away, faster than the speed of sound, giving the enemy no warning, no defense. Vergeltungswaffe 2, Retribution Weapon 2. The usual nuisance, or doctor? Asked a young SS guard, trying for bravado but failing. Von Braun merely looked up, his pale blue eyes reflecting a mix of irritation and clinical curiosity. No, Corporal. This is more than a nuisance. This is the Royal Air Force's Operation Hydra. He knew the stakes better than anyone. Piedmont was the epicenter of the Third Reich's most advanced engineering project, a marvel of human ingenuity powered by the unforgivable fuel of fanaticism and slave labor from the adjacent concentration camp, KZ Dora. If the Allies destroyed the test stand X and the launch bunkers, Hitler's promised retaliation against the British homeland would be delayed, perhaps permanently. The tremor became a violent jolt. The air filled with the deafening, gut-punching crump of high-explosive bombs. Shrapnel, singing, deadly whistles, ricocheted off the concrete above. The attack was surgical, aimed precisely at the housing barracks and the technical offices. The first wave, Avro Lancasters from Bomber Command, had arrived right on schedule, dropping cookie blockbusters designed to obliterate reinforced structures. Von Braun clutched a leather-bound notebook containing the delicate calculus of their liquid-fueled engines. The bombs were not just destroying buildings. They were disrupting the meticulous, almost fanatical process of creation. The Führer demanded results. The war depended on these rockets. More than that, von Braun's own dream, the dream of reaching the stars, depended on the successful continuation of this horrific enterprise. Suddenly, the lights flickered and died. An acrid smell of burning oil and pulverized concrete invaded the bunker. In the absolute darkness, the sounds of panic shouts mingled with the sustained roar of the second wave of bombers passing overhead. The SS corporal, his bravado gone, began to pray. Von Braun, however, found an odd sort of clarity. If Piedmont was destroyed, the Allies would inherit the secrets of rocketry. If they survived, Germany would still lose the war, but the secrets, and the men who held them, might be preserved. When the all-clear finally sounded hours later, the facility was a smoking ruin. The devastation was total. But beneath the rubble in scattered pieces of paper, and most importantly, inside the heads of men like Wernher von Braun, the blueprints for space travel remained intact, waiting for the war to end, and a new patron to emerge. This raid was the start of the end for the V2 program in Germany. But for von Braun and his colleagues, it was merely the first step of an unlikely journey westward. He knew their value transcended the collapsing regime. Their scientific capital was too immense to be discarded, a dark treasure waiting for its new owner. The true genius of Piedmont wasn't the rocket itself, but the men who could build it. April 1945. Nordhausen, Germany. The Harz Mountains. The war was collapsing around the German nation like a poorly constructed building. While Allied tanks chewed through the last vestiges of the Wehrmacht's defense, a different kind of war, a scientific one, was being waged in the shadows. The intelligence services of the United States and the Soviet Union were locked in a frantic, escalating scavenger hunt, the race for the spoils of science. The primary targets were the revolutionary rocket technology, and, more critically, the brilliant minds behind them. Deep inside the Harz Mountains, in the subterranean factory known as the Middlework, the last V2 rockets were being assembled, fueled by the relentless, fatal labor of thousands of concentration camp prisoners. By this point, more slaves had died producing the V2 than people had been killed by its payloads. As the Western Allies approached, Wernher von Braun made his move. He received conflicting orders from Berlin. Destroy all technical documentation to prevent it from falling into enemy hands. He ignored them. Von Braun and his most trusted associates, nearly 500 top engineers and scientists, knew their future depended on the preservation of their work. They loaded 37 freight cars with crates containing the meticulously organized V2 blueprints, test data, and development notes. This was their bargaining chip. Von Braun, wounded a few weeks earlier in a car accident, led his cadre south into the relative safety of the Bavarian Alps, trusting that the Americans would recognize the value of what they carried. Meanwhile, the U.S. Army's Technical Intelligence Field Team T-Force, a specialized unit including ordnance experts and German-speaking scientists, zeroed in on the middlework. They arrived to a scene of profound horror, a vast, cathedral-like underground factory, strewn with the skeletal remains of the slave laborers, a chilling testament to the efficiency of the Nazi war machine. But among the devastation, they found treasures. Teams of American soldiers and engineers began dismantling entire assembly lines, crating up components, gyroscopes, and combustion chambers. This was Operation Backfire for the hardware. The real prize, however, was human. On May 2, 1945, near the small alpine village of Riet, Austria, von Braun dispatched his younger brother, Magnus, who spoke rudimentary English, to seek out the nearest American unit. Magnus, riding a bicycle and wearing a surprisingly clean civilian jacket, approached a U.S. Army corporal of the 44th Infantry Division. "My name is Magnus von Braun," he announced, the German accent thick, but the English clear enough. "We are German rocket scientists. We wish to surrender to the Americans." The corporal, initially skeptical, quickly realized the significance of the encounter. Within hours, Wernher von Braun, wearing a crisp uniform and a calm, calculating expression, was shaking hands with American officers. He didn't surrender as a defeated enemy. He presented himself as a valuable asset, a visionary offering a gift to the future. His opening pitch was audacious. He didn't want to build rockets for war. He wanted to build rockets for space. And he knew only the Americans had the resources and the ambition to match his dream. The U.S. officers knew they had secured a scientific dynasty, instantly tipping the nascent technological balance of power away from the Soviets, who were closing in on the deserted Piedmont grounds. The ultimate prize was secured, the most important technological intellects of the Reich, now in American hands. July 1945, Paris, France. U.S. Army Headquarters, Étoile. The custody of Wernher von Braun and his core team was immediately classified at the highest levels. The initial process of extracting German scientists was dubbed Operation Overcast. The original intent was temporary, to debrief the captured scientists on German technological advancements, jet propulsion, rocketry, and chemical warfare, and then return them. However, as the geopolitical landscape shifted almost instantly from wartime alliance to Cold War tension, the objective changed radically. Major General Wernher, the Deputy Commanding General for Research and Development, was acutely aware that scientific superiority would define the next global conflict. The Soviets were already proving aggressive in their capture of scientists and manufacturing equipment in their occupation zone. The term debriefing quickly became recruitment. A proposal circulated among the Pentagon and the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Secure the best minds of the defeated enemy and bring them permanently to the United States. The problem was that many of these best minds were also former members of the National Socialist German Workers' Party, NSDAP, or even the SS. Under President Truman's directives and existing U.S. policy, any former Nazi who had actively supported the regime was barred from entry. This created an insurmountable moral and logistical hurdle. Von Braun himself had been a member of the Nazi Party since 1937 and held the rank of Sturmbannführer Major. In the SS, though he and his associates claimed these memberships were purely professional necessities, required to continue their critical work. To resolve this conflict between morality and technological advantage, The project was officially renamed Operation Paperclip in late 1945. The paperclip referred to the actual paperclips used by intelligence officers to secure the new, heavily edited security dossiers of the German recruits to their original damning files. The process was simple, systematic, and completely illegal under existing U.S. immigration law, a selective and deliberate whitewashing of records. The U.S. military intelligence agencies, particularly the Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency (JIOA), were tasked with reviewing the backgrounds of the 1,600 identified scientists, engineers, and technicians. If a scientist was deemed indispensable to U.S. national security, the JIOA would systematically alter or destroy evidence of their past allegiance and involvement. Security files would be edited to read, for example, that a scientist's Nazi membership was nominal, or that they were merely a technical expert not ardent in their Nazi sympathies. This was a dirty job, executed in the quiet confidence of post-war bureaucracy. One official memo stated the goal: to exploit these German scientific specialists, it is essential that the evidence of their war crimes be erased. The moral cost was deemed acceptable collateral damage in the face of the burgeoning Soviet threat. The United States was knowingly importing not just rockets, but the ethical compromises that came with them. By September 1945, the first contingent of paperclip scientists, including von Braun's core team, was covertly shipped to Fort Strong, Massachusetts, marking their arrival on American soil as protected, if ethically compromised, intellectual refugees. Late 1945, Fort Strong, Massachusetts, and White Sands Proving Ground, New Mexico. The arrival of the paperclip scientists in America was less a grand welcome and more a period of intense, isolated scrutiny. The initial group of rocketry experts, led by von Braun, found themselves confined to Fort Strong, a former coastal artillery fort in Boston Harbor. They were designated as special employees of the U.S. Army Ordnance Corps, operating in a bureaucratic limbo. Neither prisoners of war nor free citizens, but highly valuable property. The American scientists and military personnel tasked with overseeing them were initially wary. The Germans, many still speaking little English, were disciplined, reserved, and almost obsessively focused on their work. They wore crisp, if slightly dated, civilian clothing, maintained a strict hierarchy, and treated von Braun with a deference bordering on reverence. The Americans, grappling with the recent victory and the unsettling reality of employing their former enemies, struggled to reconcile the scientific genius with the moral baggage. The goal, however, was not integration. It was immediate exploitation of their knowledge. The U.S. Army had already shipped nearly 100 complete V-2 rockets and the components for hundreds more from the middlework factory floor. These were now stored at the White Sands Proving Ground in the desolate, vast expanses of New Mexico. The next critical step was to reassemble and launch them, an act that only the men who had designed them could successfully accomplish. In early 1946, von Braun and his core team were relocated across the country to the austere, sun-baked landscape of White Sands. This transition was a cultural shock. The sophisticated research centers of Piedmont were replaced by rudimentary barracks and the harsh environment of the American Southwest. Yet, this isolation proved conducive to their work. The team immediately dove into the task of translating their German notes, often scribbled hastily during the collapse of the Reich, into English engineering manuals. Their first operational success came swiftly. On April 16, 1946, the first captured V-2 rocket was launched from White Sands, designated V-2 No. 1. It was a technological feat, proof that the complex German systems could be successfully transplanted and operated by the same hands, albeit under a new flag. Over the next 5 years, 67 more V-2s would be launched from White Sands. These launches, often carrying scientific instruments instead of warheads, were not about immediate military aggression. They were about learning. American engineers and graduate students swarmed the German team, absorbing their knowledge of propulsion, guidance, and high-altitude atmospheric research. Von Braun, seeing his rockets soar again, used every successful launch as leverage. He began his masterful campaign to sell his ultimate vision, not just guided missiles for the Army, but orbital satellites and manned missions to the moon. He adapted quickly, learning English fluently and mastering the American art of public relations. He understood that to survive and build his dream, he had to become an American celebrity, deftly deflecting any mention of Piemund's shadow, the KZ Dora slave laborers, or his SS rank. He was no longer a Nazi scientist. He was an American rocket pioneer. The 1950s and 1960s. Huntsville, Alabama. The Marshall Space Flight Center. The true apotheosis of Operation Paperclip occurred in Huntsville, Alabama, which quickly transformed from a sleepy southern town into Rocket City, USA. By 1950, von Braun and his entire team had been moved to the newly established Redstone Arsenal, where they began developing the Redstone Missile, America's first large ballistic missile and the direct ancestor of the rockets that would carry the first Americans into space. This relocation solidified the German group's place at the core of the U.S. space program. Wernher von Braun's ascent was meteoric and skillfully managed. He received full U.S. citizenship in 1955, swearing an oath of allegiance just 10 years after commanding his last V2 launch for the Third Reich. He became the face of American rocketry, appearing frequently on television, publishing articles in popular magazines like Collier's, and even consulting for Walt Disney on a series of educational films about space travel. He was presented to the public as a clean-cut, visionary genius, the epitome of scientific progress. The press, eager for Cold War heroes, willingly accepted the sanitized narrative provided by the military. The ultimate reward for the paperclip gamble came with the Soviet launch of Sputnik in 1957. The American public was shocked, the military humiliated. This panic immediately elevated von Braun's importance from a respected military consultant to a national savior. In 1960, when NASA was created, von Braun was appointed the first director of the Marshall Space Flight Center, MSFC, in Huntsville. His team, the men who had once worn SS uniforms and overseen slave labor, now formed the backbone of the American Space Agency. Under von Braun's direction, MSFC designed and built the Saturn V rocket, a machine of unprecedented power that would successfully carry the Apollo missions to the moon. Every stage of the Saturn V, from its monumental F-1 engines to its complex guidance systems, was an evolutionary descendant of the foundational V2 technology developed at Piemund and Middlework. The success of the Apollo program, celebrated worldwide as the triumph of American democracy, was fundamentally built upon the scientific infrastructure and human capital secured by the ethically fraught Operation Paperclip. Yet, the cost of that success was the deliberate suppression of historical truth. While von Braun spoke passionately of the future, the thousands of slave laborers from KZ Dora who perished manufacturing his V2s were rarely, if ever, mentioned. The crucial fact of the whitewashed records remained a state secret for decades. The American government made a chillingly pragmatic choice, sacrificing ethical integrity and historical transparency for technological supremacy against the Soviet Union. The shadow of Piemund, the dark secret of Operation Paperclip, was the unseen foundation of the moon landing, a historical paradox where the ambition of escaping Earth began with a decision to bury the sins of the past.